The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows of the Williams family's cozy Philadelphia home, casting a warm, golden glow across the dining table. Inside, the lively hum of an ordinary weekday filled the air. At the table sat 14-year-old twins Miles and Sophia Williams, their heads bent together over a shared notebook. Miles tapped his pencil against the paper, deep in concentration over the intricate math problem that sprawled before him. "What if we try grouping these terms differently?" Sophia suggested, leaning closer. Her thick, curly hair brushed the notebook as she pointed at a section of the equation with her pencil. Miles's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. "That might actually work!" he exclaimed. His pencil moved rapidly across the page, numbers and symbols spilling onto the paper in neat rows. "See?" Sophia added excitedly, grabbing her own pencil to follow along. "If we isolate these, the solution starts to appear." Their father, Michael Williams, watched from the other end of the table, his eyes crinkling with pride. He adjusted his reading glasses and leaned in to get a better view of their work. "You two are something else," he said, his rich baritone voice filled with affection. "My brilliant mathematicians. You're tackling problems I didn't see until college." In the kitchen, Jasmine Williams stirred a pot of her signature chicken stew, its savory aroma wafting through the house. She turned to glance at her family, a soft smile on her face as she observed the scene. "Don't let dinner get cold," she called, her tone playful but firm. "The stew's ready, so wrap it up, brainiacs." "Just a few more seconds, Mom," Miles replied, his excitement bubbling as the solution began to take shape. Jasmine chuckled, shaking her head as she turned back to the stove. "Your father's created little math monsters." Michael laughed heartily, rising to walk over to his children. Placing a hand on each of their shoulders, he examined their work more closely. "You're applying concepts we haven't even touched on during our weekend study sessions. I'm impressed." "We've been reading ahead in the textbook you gave us," Sophia said, beaming with pride. "That's my girl," Michael said, his voice filled with warmth as he gently squeezed her shoulder. "Always going the extra mile." With one last flourish of his pencil, Miles circled their answer. "Got it!" he exclaimed triumphantly. Michael leaned closer, his face glowing with pride as he reviewed their work. "Perfect," he said, nodding with satisfaction. "You two make an incredible team. This approach is not only correct, but creative, too." Jasmine approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "All right, geniuses," she said, a teasing tone in her voice. "Time to eat. Michael, help me set the table, please?" "On it," he replied, still grinning at his children's accomplishment. As he turned toward the kitchen, his smile faltered. A sudden sharp pain shot through his chest. He froze, his hand flying to the spot as his face contorted in agony. "Michael?" Jasmine's voice rose in concern, her cheerful demeanor replaced by alarm. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't manage more than a weak gasp. His knees buckled and he collapsed against the table, sending papers scattering to the floor. "Dad!" Sophia and Miles shouted in unison, leaping from their chairs. Jasmine rushed to his side, her years as a nurse guiding her actions despite the panic threatening to overwhelm her. "Michael, stay with me," she said firmly, lowering him to the ground with Miles's help. "Sophia, get my phone. It's in my purse by the door." Sophia dashed to retrieve the phone while Miles knelt beside his father, holding his hand tightly. Michael's breathing was shallow and labored, his face pale and drawn. Jasmine dialed 911, her voice steady even as tears brimmed in her eyes. "This is Jasmine Williams," she said quickly. "My husband is having a heart attack. Please, send help immediately. We're at 768 Maple Avenue, Unit 2. Sophia returned, clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline. She knelt beside her brother, gripping his shoulder for comfort. "Help is on the way," Jasmine reassured Michael, her voice firm yet gentle. "You're going to be all right. Just hold on for us." The once warm atmosphere of their home had shattered, replaced by a terrifying stillness. The math problem they'd solved moments ago lay forgotten on the floor, a poignant reminder of how quickly life could change. The overcast sky mirrored the somber mood as friends and family gathered at Green Meadow Cemetery. The Williams family stood together in silence, facing the gleaming casket draped with a spray of white lilies. The wind carried the low murmur of the pastor's words as he delivered a eulogy that barely registered in Miles's mind. His focus remained on the casket, on the finality of it all. His father was gone. Miles sat rigid in his folding chair, his hands clenched in his lap. Next to him, Sophia gripped his hand tightly, her tears flowing freely. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and yet she held onto her brother with a fierce grip, as if grounding them both in their shared grief. On Sophia's other side, Jasmine sat with a quiet strength that defied the storm of emotion within her. She kept an arm around each twin, her face composed but her eyes red-rimmed. Michael Williams was more than a husband and father, the pastor said, his voice strong and steady. He was a mentor, a friend, and a pillar of his community. His passion for education and his dedication to his family were unmatched. Miles's chest tightened at the words. The memory of his father's warm encouragement, his pride whenever they solved a tough problem together, was still vivid. It felt impossible to reconcile that vibrant presence with the stillness beneath the flowers. After the service, the mourners approached to offer their condolences. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues shared kind words and memories of Michael, each story adding to the weight of loss. The twins thanked them politely, their voices subdued, while Jasmine nodded and offered brief smiles of gratitude. By the time they returned to their apartment, the weight of the day felt unbearable. The normally cozy space now seemed hollow, as if the very walls mourned Michael's absence. Jasmine guided the twins to the couch where they had spent countless evenings as a family. "Kids," she began, her voice soft but steady, "we need to talk about our next steps." She reached out, holding each of their hands in hers. "I've been thinking a lot about what's best for us, and I've made a decision." Miles and Sophia exchanged a wary glance. They knew that tone. It always preceded a difficult conversation. "Aunt Rachel has offered us a place in Hillcrest," Jasmine continued. "She's already found me a position at the hospital there, and it's a quieter town with a good school system. I think it's the fresh start we need." "Move?" Sophia's voice cracked with disbelief. "But this is our home. This is where Dad, or where everything is." "I know, sweetheart," Jasmine said, her own voice faltering for a moment. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. "But staying here, trying to hold on to what's gone, it's not helping any of us heal. Hillcrest is smaller, calmer. I'll be able to work fewer hours and spend more time with you both." Miles frowned, staring at the floor. "But what about our math program? Dad worked so hard to get us into it." "And my debate team?" Sophia added, her voice rising. "I've been working all year for that tournament." Jasmine squeezed their hands. "Hillcrest High has strong programs too. I've already looked into it. You'll still have opportunities to excel, and I promise I'll do everything I can to support you." The twins sat in stunned silence. The idea of leaving their home, their friends, and the life they'd built felt like losing their father all over again. "When?" Miles finally asked. "At the end of the month," Jasmine said gently. "That gives us a little time to pack and say goodbye." Miles tightened his grip on his mother's hand. Sophia's expression hardened with resistance, but she didn't argue further. Jasmine pulled them both into a tight embrace, her tears finally spilling over as she whispered, "We'll make it through this. Together." Weeks later, the moving truck rumbled down their familiar street, loaded with boxes and memories. Miles stood on the sidewalk, watching as the movers secured the last of their belongings. Sophia was beside him, clutching her math textbook like a lifeline. Jasmine appeared, carrying the last small box of personal items. She smiled softly at her children. "That's everything," she said. "Are you ready?" Neither answered. Instead, they turned to look at their apartment building one last time. The third-floor window that had framed so many family dinners and quiet nights seemed to watch them leave with a silent farewell. The drive to Hillcrest was long and quiet, punctuated only by Jasmine's occasional attempts at conversation. "Aunt Rachel says the park near our new house is beautiful," she said at one point, "and the library's just a short walk away." Miles didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the blur of trees and towns passing by. Sophia sat with her textbook open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in hours. The weight of the move pressed down on them, silent and suffocating. When they finally arrived, the town of Hillcrest felt worlds apart from Philadelphia. The streets were lined with tidy houses, each with well-manicured lawns and picket fences. The quiet was almost unnerving. Jasmine pulled into the driveway of their new home, a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and a welcoming porch. "Here we are," Jasmine said, trying to sound cheerful as she parked the car. "Home, sweet home." The twins exchanged a glance, their uncertainty mirrored in each other's eyes. They stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The house loomed before them, a blank slate that held none of the warmth or memories of their old life. The morning sun cast a pale glow over Hillcrest High School, as Sophia and Miles stood at the bottom of the front steps, their new school looming above them like an unfamiliar fortress. Students moved past in clusters, laughing and chatting as if they'd known each other forever. The twins stood apart from the flow, clutching their backpacks and exchanging nervous glances. "I don't like this," Sophia muttered, her voice barely audible. She smoothed her braids, a telltale sign of her nerves. Miles adjusted his jacket and tried to look composed, but his grip on the straps of his bag betrayed his unease. "We'll be fine," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Jasmine stood between them, her nurse's scrubs neatly pressed despite the early hour. "You're going to be great," she said, her voice filled with the kind of firm encouragement only a mother can muster. She adjusted Miles's collar and smiled. "Remember, you're both smart and capable. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The mention of their father hung in the air like an unspoken reminder. Sophia reached out and squeezed her brother's hand briefly before pulling away. "I love you both so much," Jasmine added, pulling them into a quick, tight hug. "Have a great first day." The twins watched her walk back to the car, the sight of her driving away leaving them feeling even more alone. They turned toward the school and climbed the steps together, stepping into the crowded hallway where their new reality awaited. Room 204 was at the far end of the corridor, the sound of locker doors slamming and students laughing reverberating around them. Sophia glanced at the schedule clutched in her hand, her confidence dwindling with each step. "Found it," Miles said, nodding toward the classroom door. Inside, students were already settling into their seats. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Linda Barnes, a tall, imposing woman with silver-streaked hair tied in a no-nonsense bun. Her piercing eyes swept over the room, and when the twins entered, her gaze lingered on them for a moment too long. "You must be the Williams twins," she said, her voice brisk. Without waiting for confirmation, she consulted a piece of paper on her desk. "Sophia and Miles?" "Yes, ma'am," Sophia answered, her voice steady despite the subtle tension in the air. Mrs. Barnes's eyes flicked to the advanced math textbooks they carried. Her lips pursed slightly. "I see you were in honors math at your previous school. Hillcrest's program is very challenging," she said, her tone carrying an unmistakable note of doubt. "I trust you'll find it rigorous." Sophia and Miles exchanged a glance, their expressions neutral but their thoughts loud. They'd faced this skepticism before, and it always stung. "Take your seats," Mrs. Barnes continued, gesturing to 2 desks on opposite sides of the room. Sophia hesitated, but Miles nodded and headed to the desk by the window. She reluctantly moved to the desk near the door, the distance between them feeling like another test. As they settled into their seats, Sophia noticed Mrs. Barnes's gaze lingering on them again, her expression unreadable. Around the room, some students cast curious glances in their direction, but most quickly returned to their conversations or notebooks. A few minutes into the lesson, Mrs. Barnes turned to the whiteboard and began writing a sprawling algebraic equation. Her marker squeaked loudly, filling the board with numbers, variables, and symbols that looked almost impenetrable. "This," she announced, stepping back with an air of authority, "is an example of the level of difficulty you can expect on this week's quiz. Who would like to solve it?" The classroom fell silent. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the teacher. Sophia studied the equation intently. Her mind raced through the possibilities, breaking the problem into smaller pieces. It was complex, but she recognized the patterns. It reminded her of the challenges her father used to pose during their study sessions. She raised her hand. From across the room, Miles's hand went up almost simultaneously. Mrs. Barnes's brows arched in surprise. She glanced between them, her expression skeptical but intrigued. "Miles, why don't you take a stab at it?" she said. Miles rose from his seat and walked to the board, picking up a marker with quiet confidence. As he began working through the equation, he narrated each step, his voice calm and precise. "First, we factor the quadratic expression," he explained, writing neatly. "Then isolate the terms to simplify the solution. Don't forget to check the constraints on the variables," Sophia chimed in from her desk. Her tone wasn't boastful but collaborative, a natural extension of the teamwork they'd always shared. Miles nodded and adjusted his work accordingly. Within minutes, he finished the problem, stepping back to reveal a clean, complete solution. The room was silent as Mrs. Barnes examined his work. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she nodded. "The answer is correct," she said, though her tone lacked enthusiasm. "However, don't let one correct solution make you overconfident. This class is a marathon, not a sprint." The words were meant as a warning, but the condescension in her tone was clear. Several students glanced at the twins, some with curiosity, others with quiet sympathy. Miles returned to his seat. His earlier confidence dimmed. Across the room, Sophia caught his eye. She gave him a small, supportive smile, her defiance evident. Their unspoken connection was clear. This wouldn't be the last time they had to prove themselves. The next day, the tension from their first class still lingered as Sophia and Miles walked into Mrs. Barnes's room. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the whiteboard where a new problem awaited, a daunting trigonometric equation that spanned nearly the entire board. Mrs. Barnes tapped her marker against the edge of the whiteboard. "This," she declared, "will challenge your ability to synthesize multiple concepts. Anyone care to try?" The class sat in awkward silence, most students avoiding her gaze. The complexity of the formula intimidated even the brightest in the room. Sophia's eyes narrowed as she studied the equation. It was advanced, no doubt, but something about it seemed oddly familiar. Her father had often woven similar problems into their lessons, pushing them to think creatively. She raised her hand, her determination evident. Mrs. Barnes's eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment, a faint smirk played on the teacher's lips. "All right, Sophia," she said, her tone both challenging and skeptical. "Show us what you've got." Sophia stood, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. She walked to the board, took the marker, and began breaking the problem into smaller steps. As she wrote, her mind replayed the strategies her father had taught her, methods that emphasized understanding over rote memorization. "First, identify the relationships between the angles," she said, her voice steady. "From there, simplify the sine and cosine components to create a common denominator." Behind her, Mrs. Barnes crossed her arms, watching with a raised brow. From the corner of her eye, Sophia saw her classmates exchanging curious glances. She felt the weight of their stares but pressed on, her marker moving confidently across the board. Midway through her explanation, Miles spoke up from his desk. "Don't forget to apply the reciprocal identities. That'll make the next step cleaner." "I was just getting to that," Sophia replied, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips as she incorporated his suggestion. By the time she finished, the board was filled with a neatly organized solution. Sophia stepped back, handing the marker to Mrs. Barnes, who studied the work with a critical eye. "Well," Mrs. Barnes said after a long pause, "the solution is correct. However," she turned to face the class, her gaze sweeping over the students, "it's important to remember that solving problems under pressure is very different from having extra time to think. Speed and accuracy will both be required during the quiz." Sophia's chest tightened at the subtle dismissal. She returned to her seat, her triumphant moment overshadowed by Mrs. Barnes's refusal to acknowledge her effort fully. Across the room, Miles gave her an encouraging nod, a silent message of solidarity. The other students remained quiet, but Sophia noticed a few furtive smiles and nods of approval from some classmates. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bolster her resolve. Later that day, during lunch in the bustling cafeteria, Sophia and Miles sat at a table near the window. Their trays of food sat mostly untouched as they talked quietly about the morning's events. "She's testing us," Sophia said, stabbing at her salad with her fork. "Every time we solve something, it's like she's waiting for us to fail." Miles nodded. "Yeah, and she's not subtle about it either. But we've been through worse." "True," Sophia agreed. "Still, it's frustrating. How many times do we have to prove we belong here?" Before Miles could respond, a boy with sandy blonde hair and a kind smile approached their table. He carried a tray and wore a t-shirt with the school's robotics club logo emblazoned on it. "Hey," he said, gesturing toward an empty seat. "Mind if I join you?" The twins exchanged a glance before Sophia shrugged. "Sure." The boy sat down, setting his tray on the table. "I'm Alex. I'm in your math class." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Our performance in Mrs. Barnes's class caught your attention?" Alex chuckled. "Something like that. It's not every day someone takes her down a peg. She's, known for being tough on new students." Miles leaned back in his chair. "We noticed." "I just wanted to say I thought what you did was cool," Alex continued. "Most people don't even try to raise their hands in her class, let alone solve the problems." Sophia felt a flicker of warmth at the compliment. "Thanks, it's nice to hear that." Alex nodded. "If you ever need help navigating the school or dealing with Mrs. Barnes, I'm around. Robotics Club meets on Fridays, by the way. You should check it out." Sophia and Miles exchanged another glance, this time with curiosity. "We'll think about it," Sophia said, her tone cautious but not dismissive. "Cool," Alex said, standing up. "See you around." As he walked away, Sophia turned to Miles. "What do you think?" "He seems all right," Miles said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Might be good to have an ally." "Yeah," Sophia agreed. "It's about time something positive happened around here." The twins didn't know it yet, but that small interaction was the beginning of a shift. Their determination, bolstered by unexpected support, would soon lead to events that would challenge their resilience and redefine their place in Hillcrest High. The days at Hillcrest High slowly began to settle into a rhythm, though the twins still felt like outsiders. Mrs. Barnes continued to maintain a critical distance, her subtle disapproval a constant shadow in the classroom. Despite this, Sophia and Miles excelled, their natural aptitude for problem-solving allowing them to navigate even the toughest assignments. One afternoon, Mrs. Barnes presented a particularly difficult problem, a multivariable calculus challenge that seemed to stump the entire class. As the teacher scanned the room, she locked eyes with Sophia and Miles, her expression almost daring them to step up. Sophia raised her hand first, but this time Mrs. Barnes smirked. "Let's see if someone else can give it a try," she said pointedly, her eyes flicking away. Sophia's hand slowly lowered, her jaw tightening. Across the room, Miles stared down at his notebook, frustration burning in his chest. They'd worked harder than anyone else in the class, but it felt as though Mrs. Barnes was determined to deny them even the smallest victories. A few moments passed in tense silence before Alex, the boy from the robotics club, raised his hand. "I think I can solve it," he said, glancing at the twins as if to say, "I've got your back." Mrs. Barnes nodded, gesturing for him to proceed. Alex approached the board and began working through the problem, occasionally glancing at Sophia and Miles for confirmation. When he finished, he stepped back, his solution accurate but presented in a way that left room for the twins to elaborate. "It's correct," Miles said aloud, unable to resist the opportunity to speak. "But you could simplify the second-to-last step by using substitution. It makes the solution cleaner. Mrs. Barnes's eyes narrowed. "Interesting," she said, her tone clipped. "Why don't you come up and show us, Mr. Williams?" Miles rose, his movements deliberate and calm. He picked up the marker and quickly reworked the second-to-last step, explaining his reasoning as he went. When he finished, the board reflected a streamlined, elegant solution. The room was silent for a moment before Alex clapped lightly, a grin spreading across his face. A few other students joined in, their quiet applause cutting through the tension like a beam of light. Mrs. Barnes's expression remained stony. "Very well," she said. "Let's move on." That evening, Sophia and Miles sat in their shared bedroom, their textbooks spread out across the floor. The small house felt a little less foreign now, though the absence of their father still loomed large. "Do you think she'll ever stop looking for ways to trip us up?" Sophia asked, flipping through her notes with a sigh. "No," Miles replied bluntly, "but that doesn't mean we stop." Sophia glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Dad would have said the same thing." "Exactly," Miles said. "And he would have told us to focus on what we can control, not what we can't." The memory of their father's advice settled over them like a warm blanket. For the first time in weeks, the twins allowed themselves a moment of peace, their determination quietly reaffirmed. Her back turned to the class. Mrs. Barnes continued scribbling on the whiteboard, oblivious to the tension she was creating. When she finally turned around, her eyes swept past Miles's raised hand as though it wasn't even there. "Are there any questions?" she asked, addressing the room at large. Miles kept his hand up, stretching it higher, his determination unwavering. A few students stole glances at him but said nothing. The silence stretched painfully, filling the room like an uncomfortable weight. After several seconds, Mrs. Barnes finally tilted her head in acknowledgement, her gaze cold and impatient. "Yes, Mr. Williams?" she said, her tone dripping with the dismissiveness the twins had come to expect. Miles cleared his throat, steadying his voice. "I was wondering about the second part of the formula," he began. "Shouldn't the cosine function have a different relationship to the angle given the initial conditions?" The question was thoughtful and precise, demonstrating a deep understanding of the problem. It was the kind of critical analysis their father had always encouraged, a blend of curiosity and careful reasoning. Mrs. Barnes's lips curved into a tight, condescending smile. She clasped her hands in front of her, her eyes narrowing as she regarded Miles. "Well," she said, drawing out the word, "perhaps math just isn't for everyone." Her tone was sugary sweet, but her words stung like a slap. Some students squirmed in their seats, others buried their faces in their notebooks, unwilling to meet Miles's eyes. Mrs. Barnes continued, "Maybe simpler subjects would suit some students better." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Miles lowered his hand slowly, his confidence deflating under the weight of her disdain. The echo of his father's encouragement felt distant now, drowned out by the sting of Mrs. Barnes's cruelty. Across the room, Sophia gripped the edge of her desk, her jaw tightening. Her right hand clenched into a fist under the table, her nails digging into her palm. The physical pain was nothing compared to the fiery anger simmering inside her as she watched her brother's spirit crushed under the weight of their teacher's dismissiveness. Meanwhile, Daniel Hayes, chair of the school board, walked through the quiet hallways of Hillcrest High, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiles. At 6'2", with a broad-shouldered build and an impeccably tailored suit, his presence was commanding even when he moved silently. He paused briefly outside Mrs. Barnes's classroom, hearing the muffled cadence of her voice through the door. With practiced discretion, he stepped inside and positioned himself at the back of the room, standing motionless as he observed. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and disinfectant. Afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching the specks of dust floating in the air. Students sat in neat rows, some furiously taking notes, others sneaking glances at their phones under their desks. At the far side of the room, Miles's hand rose hesitantly into the air. Daniel's sharp eyes took in the interaction that followed, Mrs. Barnes turning to face him with that same cold, sharp-edged tone. "Yes?" she said curtly. Miles's voice was steady but quiet. "I don't understand how you transitioned from step 3 to step 4. Could you explain that again?" Mrs. Barnes's lips thinned into a straight line. "This should be obvious to you by now," she snapped. "Let's move on." The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched Miles's shoulders slump and his eyes drop to his desk. Around him, students shifted uncomfortably, their unease palpable. Mrs. Barnes turned back to the board, uncapping her marker with a sharp click. She began writing another equation, but her hand faltered when her eyes darted to the back of the room. There, standing tall and stern, was Daniel Hayes. Her hand froze mid-stroke. A flush crept up her neck as she straightened her spine almost reflexively, her demeanor snapping into a forced professionalism. Spinning back to face the class, she flashed a painfully artificial smile. "You know," she said, her voice suddenly pitched higher. "That's an excellent question, Miles. Let's take a closer look." Sophia raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze bouncing between her brother and the imposing figure at the back of the room. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Daniel stood unmoving, his expression carved from stone as Mrs. Barnes fumbled through a painfully enthusiastic explanation. Her sentences tumbled out in a rush, her performance transparent to anyone paying attention. After a few minutes of this charade, Daniel turned and exited the classroom, his steps purposeful and firm. Within minutes, Daniel was striding down the hallway toward the principal's office. Without pausing to knock, he pushed the door open, his presence startling Principal Margaret Benson mid-sentence. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "We need to talk, now." Principal Benson set down her pen, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Daniel, I wasn't expecting you today. What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" Daniel replied, his tone sharper now. "Is what I just witnessed in Linda Barnes's classroom." Margaret gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Please, sit and explain." "I'll stand," Daniel said curtly. "Linda Barnes is actively belittling and dismissing her students. I saw it firsthand, and I doubt this is an isolated incident." Margaret adjusted her glasses, visibly uncomfortable. "That's a serious accusation. Linda's been here for years." "Experience doesn't justify prejudice," Daniel shot back. "The moment she saw me, her behavior shifted completely. She knows what she's doing, Margaret, and it's unacceptable." Margaret sighed, looking down at her desk. "What exactly are you suggesting we do?" Daniel's tone brooked no argument. "Call her in. Now." The tension in Principal Benson's office was palpable, as Margaret hesitated, her fingers hovering over the intercom button. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she pressed it. "Mrs. Barnes, please come to my office immediately." The minutes that followed were thick with silence. Margaret shuffled papers absent-mindedly, her movements betraying her nervousness. Daniel remained standing, his arms crossed as he stared out the window, his jaw set in a firm line. The knock at the door was tentative. "Come in," Margaret called. Mrs. Barnes entered, her usual air of confidence noticeably absent. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Daniel still standing in the room. Clutching her gradebook to her chest, she looked between the two administrators with forced composure. "Linda," Margaret began, her voice even, "please have a seat. We need to discuss what happened in your classroom today." Mrs. Barnes perched on the edge of the chair, her posture stiff. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her unease. Daniel wasted no time. "I witnessed you dismissing a student's question in a way that was not only unprofessional but entirely inappropriate," he said firmly. "Your behavior changed the moment you saw me in the room, which tells me you're fully aware of how unacceptable your actions were." Mrs. Barnes's cheeks flushed a deep red. "That's not fair," she protested, her voice rising defensively. Teaching advanced mathematics requires maintaining high standards. Some students simply need to be challenged. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Is that what you call it? Making a student feel humiliated for asking a question is not challenging them. It's shutting them down. Margaret held up a hand, her tone measured. Linda, Daniel's concerns are serious. We need to address them. Can you explain why your demeanor shifted so dramatically when you realized he was observing? Mrs. Barnes faltered. I was simply trying to ensure my explanations were thorough, she said, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirt. When someone in authority is present, it's natural to be a little more careful. What's natural? Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp. Is treating every student with respect, regardless of who's watching. The fact that you don't suggests there's a deeper issue here. I treat all my students equally, Mrs. Barnes insisted, though her voice wavered. If Miles felt singled out, it wasn't my intention. Margaret leaned forward, clasping her hands on her desk. Linda, we need to ensure all students feel supported in the classroom. This isn't just about one incident. It's about creating a positive environment for everyone. I can do better, Mrs. Barnes said quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. I didn't mean any harm. Daniel's expression didn't soften. Intent doesn't excuse impact, he said firmly. What I saw today was unprofessional conduct, and it has no place in this school. I recommend immediate termination. Margaret's eyes widened as she glanced between Daniel and Mrs. Barnes, who had gone pale. Daniel, that's a drastic step, she said cautiously. Perhaps a probationary period would be more appropriate? Probation? Daniel's voice was incredulous. How many students have already been affected by her behavior? How many more have to endure it before we act? Margaret shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. We need to follow proper procedures. Firing a longtime teacher without due process could have consequences for the school. Daniel's frustration was evident as he ran a hand through his hair. Every day we delay is another day students suffer. That should be our priority. Margaret dabbed at her forehead with a tissue, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her. After a long pause, she straightened her posture and spoke with finality. Linda, you'll be placed on probation effective immediately. Any further incidents, no matter how minor, will result in termination. The words barely left her mouth before Mrs. Barnes crumbled. Sliding from her chair to her knees, she clasped her hands together, tears streaming down her face. Please, she sobbed, mascara running down her cheeks. Don't let me lose everything. I'll change. I promise. Daniel watched her breakdown with an expression of stony skepticism. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy with frustration. The door closed behind him with a definitive slam, leaving the room in silence. Margaret waited until his footsteps faded before addressing Mrs. Barnes again. Her voice was firm, her expression steely. This is your last chance, Linda. Don't make me regret it. Mrs. Barnes rose shakily to her feet, wiping at her tear-streaked face. She nodded mutely, clutching her gradebook like a lifeline as she exited the office, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her probation. The cafeteria buzzed with energy as students gathered around tables, chatting and scrolling through their phones. The hum of conversation and bursts of laughter filled the room, but the mood shifted abruptly when a ripple of laughter erupted from the corner where Brad Thomas, the school's star quarterback, held court with his usual entourage. "Brad, you actually posted it?" one of his friends called out, drawing more attention to the group. Brad leaned back in his chair, his grin smug. "Why not?" "It's just a joke," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. Phones buzzed and lit up as students hurried to check the post. Brad had uploaded a photo of himself holding a prom invitation, scrawled with a message laced with thinly veiled racism, comparing his intended date's dark skin tone to various desserts. The girl, Erica Williams, wasn't in the cafeteria, but her name was tagged. At a nearby table, Jasmine Rivera set her phone down, her stomach turning. "That's disgusting," she muttered to her friend. "Why is everyone laughing?" Some students chuckled nervously. Others stared at their screens in shock. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react. Marcus Walker, one of the few black members of the football team, stood abruptly and walked away from Brad's table, shaking his head. "Not cool, man," he said, though his voice was drowned out by the laughter. At the far end of the cafeteria, Miles and Sophia sat with their trays, their phones buzzing with notifications. Sophia opened the post first, her expression hardening as she read the words. Her hands gripped the edges of her phone so tightly it seemed like she might crush it. Miles leaned over to read the screen, his jaw tightening. Across the room, Brad basked in the attention, high-fiving his friends. "This is disgusting," Sophia muttered, her voice low but seething. Miles nodded, his eyes narrowing as his sister's determination began to match his own. "We can't let this slide," she said firmly. "We have to do something." The library was unusually crowded for a weekday afternoon, as Sophia Johnson gathered a group of determined students around a large wooden table. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long, golden streaks across their serious faces. The usual calm of the library was replaced by quiet urgency, as murmurs and the occasional shuffle of papers filled the air. "We can't let Brad's post go unanswered," Sophia said, standing at the head of the table. Her braids were neatly tied back, and her shirt bore a bold message. "Justice is non-negotiable." This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and every time the administration ignores it. "Like the graffiti last month," Marcus Walker added. He crossed his arms over his chest, his frustration evident. "They just painted over it and acted like it never happened." "Exactly," Sophia said, pulling out a notebook. She flipped to a page filled with notes and bullet points she had written late into the night. "If we want real change, we need to make it impossible for them to ignore us. That's why I'm proposing a school-wide walkout." A ripple of whispers moved through the group. Some students nodded in agreement, while others looked uneasy. Jessica Ramirez, a sophomore with a quiet demeanor, raised her hand tentatively. "A walkout? Won't we get in trouble?" Sophia met Jessica's worried gaze with calm determination. "Maybe," she admitted. "But sometimes taking a stand means taking risks. My dad always said staying silent means accepting what's wrong. I'm not willing to do that anymore." Her voice caught slightly at the mention of her father, and Miles, seated at her right, reached out to touch her arm in silent support. She took a deep breath and continued. David Chen, Erica Williams's cousin, leaned forward, his usually soft voice firm. "We need clear demands. What exactly are we asking for?" Sophia nodded, pulling out a second sheet of paper. "I've drafted a list. First, a public apology from Brad and real consequences for his actions. Second, mandatory sensitivity training for students and staff. Third, a zero-tolerance policy for racist behavior with specific consequences for violations." The group listened intently as Sophia laid out her plan. Sarah Kim, a senior who had dealt with her own share of prejudice, leaned in. "When would the walkout happen?" "Next Wednesday," Sophia replied without hesitation. "There's a school board meeting that afternoon. If we walk out during third period, they'll have no choice but to address us." Marcus nodded. "Makes sense. Hit them where they can't ignore it." "I'll set up a private group on social media," Maya Patel offered, already typing on her phone. "We can use it to coordinate without attracting too much attention." "And I'll design flyers," James Rodriguez added, sketching ideas in his notebook. "Something simple but powerful. Just the date, time, and a message about standing up for justice." The energy at the table grew as students took on tasks, volunteering to reach out to sports teams, clubs, and other social groups. The quiet hesitance from earlier was replaced with focused determination. "Remember," Sophia said, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the group. "This only works if we stay peaceful and organized. We're not trying to create chaos. We're demanding accountability and respect." One by one, the students nodded, their resolve solidifying. "I'm in," Marcus said firmly. "Me too," Jessica added, her initial fear replaced with quiet confidence. Around the table, voices of agreement rose, and Sophia felt a surge of pride. These students, from different grades, backgrounds, and experiences, were uniting for a common cause. "It's settled then," Sophia said, her heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and hope. "Let's make this count." At exactly 10:45 a.m. the following Wednesday, the normally quiet halls of Hillcrest High School erupted with purpose. Students rose from their desks in unison, their footsteps echoing in the corridors. Classroom doors swung open as hundreds of students joined the walkout, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Sophia and Miles led a group of students from the math wing, carrying signs with messages like, "No justice, no peace," and "Hillcrest demands change." Their faces were resolute as they marched down the hallway, their numbers growing with each passing moment. Teachers stood frozen in doorways, some calling after their students ineffectively, while others simply watched, unsure how to respond. The crowd swelled as students from every grade joined in, their voices blending into a unified chant, "What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!" In the main courtyard, the marchers converged into a massive gathering. Signs waved in the air, and the rhythmic chant filled the space, echoing against the school's brick walls. The scene was both chaotic and beautifully organized, a testament to the careful planning Sophia and her group had put into the event. From her place near the front, Sophia raised a megaphone, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about one post or one student," she said, her words ringing with passion. "This is about all of us, about standing up to a system that allows racism to go unchallenged. We deserve better. Our voices deserve to be heard." Cheers erupted from the crowd, the energy palpable. Miles stepped forward to speak next, his voice steady and strong. "Today, we're showing that silence is not an option. Hillcrest can be better, and we won't stop until it is." As the chants echoed across the courtyard, the tension within the school building reached its peak. Principal Margaret Benson stood at her office window, looking out at the crowd of students gathered below. Her face was a mixture of anxiety and frustration as she turned to address her staff. "This is getting out of hand," she said, pacing the small office. "We need to act quickly before this escalates further." One of the assistant principals, Mr. Callahan, adjusted his tie nervously. "The students are organized," he said. "They're peaceful, but they're making a lot of noise. Parents and the school board are going to hear about this." Margaret sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Call security to keep an eye on things, but no one is to escalate. We can't afford to make this worse." Outside, Sophia and Miles stood together at the front of the crowd, leading the chants. Signs waved in the air, and more students joined the protest every minute. Among them were members of the Diversity Club, athletes from various teams, and students who had never spoken up before but were finally finding their voice. From the corner of her eye, Sophia noticed a group of reporters beginning to gather just outside the school gates. Someone must have tipped off the local news. She exchanged a glance with Miles, who gave her a small nod. This was it. They had reached a critical moment. Inside the administrative wing, Margaret Benson's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from concerned parents and curious journalists. Daniel Hayes appeared in the doorway, his expression firm but unreadable. "You've got a situation on your hands," he said, folding his arms. Margaret gestured toward the window. "As if I didn't notice. What do you suggest we do? Suspend them all? That'll just pour gasoline on the fire." Daniel shook his head. "No, but you can't dismiss this either. Go out there, acknowledge them, show that you're listening." Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "And then what? What if they don't back down?" "Then you listen to their demands," Daniel said simply. "And you start taking action. Ignoring them is no longer an option." Principal Benson stepped outside, flanked by 2 staff members. The chants grew quieter as students noticed her approach. Sophia gripped the megaphone tightly, her heart pounding as the principal made her way to the center of the crowd. "Students," Margaret began, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the murmurs. "I hear you. I see your concerns. I want to invite representatives from your group to meet with me and the school board this afternoon. Let's have a discussion." Sophia raised the megaphone, her voice unwavering. "We're done with empty promises. If we meet, we want real commitments. This school needs change, and we won't stop until we see it." The crowd erupted into cheers of agreement. Margaret nodded, clearly aware that she was treading on thin ice. "Then let's start that process today," she said. "I'll personally ensure your voices are heard." By late afternoon, Sophia, Miles, and a small group of student representatives sat across from the school board in the meeting room. The atmosphere was tense, but charged with purpose. The students outlined their demands, presenting their case with clarity and conviction. The board members listened, some with skeptical expressions, others nodding thoughtfully. Daniel Hayes stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed as he watched the students speak. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at their composure and determination. By the end of the meeting, several commitments had been made: a full investigation into the recent incidents, mandatory sensitivity training for students and staff, and the implementation of a clear anti-racism policy. The following week, Hillcrest High felt different. The protest had shaken the school to its core, leaving an undeniable mark. Some students returned to their routines, while others walked the halls with renewed confidence, knowing they had been part of something bigger than themselves. For Sophia and Miles, the fight wasn't over, but the first victory had been won. As they walked through the school's front doors that morning, the whispers and glances no longer carried the weight of doubt or dismissal. Instead, they held respect. Sophia looked at her brother and smiled. Dad would have been proud. Miles nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "We still have a lot to do." "And we'll do it," Sophia said, her voice firm. "Together." As the bell rang, signaling the start of a new day, the twins headed to their classroom. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, they felt ready to take it on. One step, one equation, and one act of courage at a time. "No justice, no peace." The chant began softly, a ripple that swelled into a roar as more students joined in. Mrs. Barnes froze at the whiteboard, marker poised mid-equation, her face paling as her classroom emptied. Across the hall, Mr. Peterson, the history teacher, stepped into the corridor, his jaw slack with disbelief. Ms. Rodriguez, in the middle of teaching Spanish, stared wide-eyed at the river of students flowing past her door. Signs emerged from backpacks and lockers, bold and striking. "Stop Racism at Ridgeview High," read one. Another declared, "Hate has no home here." The messages varied, but their purpose was clear. The organized chaos filled every hallway. Students from every grade, background, and social circle moved together as one. Football players marched alongside members of the drama club. Honor students held hands with artists. The usual social divides evaporated in the shared mission for justice. Principal Benson burst out of her office, her heels clicking sharply on the tiled floor. Her eyes darted around as she tried to process the scene unfolding before her. "Everyone, return to your classrooms immediately," she shouted. But her voice was swallowed by the thunderous chants of students surging past her. Serena and Miles were at the heart of the demonstration, moving with purpose through the packed corridors. Serena's voice carried above the crowd as she led the chant. "What do we want?" she called. "Justice," the students roared in response. "When do we want it?" "Now!" The twins had meticulously planned every aspect of this moment. Student leaders positioned throughout the crowd ensured order and kept the march peaceful. As the mass of students reached the school's main entrance, sunlight poured through the glass doors, illuminating the determined faces of hundreds of teenagers. Security guards stood by, looking uncertain and overwhelmed. They exchanged glances, unsure how to handle such an enormous, non-violent demonstration. The main doors swung open and students spilled onto the lawn. The morning air was crisp, the grass damp with dew. News vans, summoned by strategic social media posts, pulled up along the curb, cameras ready to capture the historic scene. The students arranged themselves on the lawn with practiced precision. Those holding signs moved to the front, creating a striking visual for the cameras. Behind them, rows of students formed a solid, unified mass, their sheer numbers impossible to ignore. Miles stepped forward, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by a fiery resolve. Standing beside Serena, he raised his fist in the air and shouted, "No more silence! No more hate!" The crowd responded in unison, their voices rising like a wave. No more silence! No more hate! From a second-floor window, Brad Thomas peered out, his face ashen. His hands trembled as he watched the powerful response his actions had provoked. Nearby, Mrs. Barnes stood frozen. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk as she caught sight of familiar faces among the protesters. A wave of emotions crossed her face, shock, guilt, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. On the lawn, Serena and Miles stood at the front, their voices ringing clear and strong. The sunlight caught their faces as they led the chants, a picture of unwavering determination. Behind them, hundreds of voices swelled in perfect harmony, refusing to be silenced. Principal Benson stepped outside, her usually composed demeanor cracking under the pressure of the moment. She raised her hands in an attempt to quiet the crowd. "Students, please," she called, her voice straining to carry over the rhythmic chants. "This is not the appropriate way to handle your concerns. Return to your classrooms immediately." But the crowd was undeterred. The chants continued, growing louder as news cameras zoomed in on the principal's increasingly strained expression. "This disruption will not solve anything," she tried again, her tone sharper now. "There are proper channels for addressing grievances." Serena stepped forward, and a hush fell over the crowd. Her braids swayed as she turned to face the principal, her voice carrying across the lawn with quiet authority. "What proper channels, Principal Benson?" she asked. "The same ones that let Brad Thomas post a racist message without consequences? The same ones that let teachers like Mrs. Barnes discriminate against students without accountability?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing louder with every passing second. Serena's voice rose. "We've tried talking. We've filed complaints. We've followed the rules and nothing changes. Racism at Ridgeview gets ignored and we're done being silent about it." Students called out their own stories, adding fuel to the fire. "Remember when James got suspended for defending himself?" one shouted. "But Tyler, who started it, only got detention." Principal Benson's hands shot up again, but her voice faltered under the weight of their accusations. "These are serious issues," she said, her tone faltering. "But they need to be discussed through the proper process." "That's exactly what we're trying to do," Serena shot back, gesturing to the crowd. "We're showing you the process isn't working." Margaret Benson's gaze darted nervously to the cameras. The news coverage would be relentless. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, her shoulders sagging. "Very well," she said. "I'll arrange a meeting with student representatives to address these concerns." "When?" Serena demanded. "Tomorrow morning, first period. We'll meet in the library." The students exchanged wary glances, years of dismissed complaints and broken promises leaving them skeptical. "We'll be there," Serena said firmly. "But if nothing changes after tomorrow, we'll be back, and we'll bring our parents and the school board." Principal Benson nodded stiffly, then turned and walked back into the building. The victory felt bittersweet. As the crowd dispersed, students returned to their routines with a lingering sense of uncertainty. On the lawn, Miles and Serena stood quietly, staring at the mural wall they had painted just days before, a vibrant testament to their cause. "This isn't over," Serena said, her voice steady. Miles nodded. "It's just the beginning." The next morning, the library at Ridgeview High was filled with tension. Principal Benson sat at a long wooden table, flanked by Daniel Hayes and several other school board members. Across from them sat Serena, Miles, and a small group of student representatives. The air was heavy with anticipation as they waited for the meeting to begin. "Thank you for coming," Principal Benson started, her voice carefully measured. "We're here to have an open discussion about your concerns and how we can move forward as a community." Serena didn't hesitate. "We've been having discussions for years, Principal Benson," she said, her tone firm. "What we need now is action." Daniel Hayes nodded subtly, encouraging the students to continue. Serena pulled out a binder filled with printed copies of testimonies, social media screenshots, and documented incidents. "These are just a few examples of what students at Ridgeview have been dealing with," she said, sliding the binder across the table. "This isn't an isolated problem. It's systemic." Principal Benson opened the binder and flipped through the pages. Her expression remained neutral, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "We've outlined 3 immediate actions we want the school to take," Miles added. His voice was steady, but his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. "First, a zero-tolerance policy for racist behavior, with clear consequences. Second, mandatory sensitivity training for staff and students. And third, a more inclusive curriculum that reflects the diversity of our student body." One of the board members cleared his throat. "These are ambitious requests," he said cautiously. "Implementing them will take time." "And yet we're expected to tolerate racism every day without delay," Serena countered. "Time isn't the issue. Priorities are." The room fell silent. Daniel Hayes broke the tension by speaking. "I've reviewed the students' demands," he said, his tone authoritative. "They are reasonable, and they align with the values this school claims to uphold. It's time we lived up to those values." Principal Benson exchanged glances with the board members. After a long pause, she sighed and straightened in her seat. "We'll start by drafting a zero-tolerance policy and scheduling sensitivity training for next semester," she said. "As for the curriculum changes, that will require a longer process." Serena leaned forward. "We'll hold you to that," she said. "If we don't see progress, we'll escalate this to the district level." Principal Benson nodded, her expression serious. "Understood." The next few weeks saw the beginnings of change at Ridgeview High. Posters announcing sensitivity training sessions appeared in hallways, and an online survey invited students to share their experiences anonymously. Teachers were encouraged to incorporate more diverse perspectives into their lessons, and the administration held meetings to draft the promised policy changes. The mural on the front lawn became a gathering place for students. During lunch breaks, they sat in its shadow, discussing their hopes for a better school culture. Elijah and Serena often found themselves answering questions from classmates about the movement. More students shared their own stories, adding to the growing momentum. "You know," Elijah said one afternoon as they stood near the mural, "this feels bigger than just Ridgeview now. It feels like something that could inspire other schools too." Serena nodded. "And that's exactly what Dad would have wanted." One evening, the Johnson family sat together in the living room, reviewing an article in the local paper about the changes at Ridgeview. The headline read, "Students Lead the Charge for Equality and Inclusion." Clara's eyes shone with pride as she looked at her children. "You've done something incredible," she said. "Something that will last far beyond your time here." Elijah smiled. "We couldn't have done it without what you and Dad taught us." As they sat together, the twins felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had started something that would echo through their community for years to come, a testament to the power of standing together and refusing to stay silent. Weeks turned into months, and the changes at Ridgeview High began to take root. Posters promoting diversity and unity lined the hallways, and training sessions became a regular part of the school's schedule. While there was resistance from some corners, the overall atmosphere began to shift. The mural outside the school transformed from a simple piece of art into a symbol of hope and pride for the students. It was the backdrop for school events, the subject of social media posts, and even the focus of a feature in the local news. For Serena and Miles, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Their days were filled with classes, meetings, and occasional interviews with reporters who were drawn to the story of the Ridgeview walkout. The twins felt the weight of their role in this movement, but also the joy of knowing they had sparked real change. One chilly morning, Serena and Miles stood at the front of the auditorium, facing an audience of teachers and students gathered for the school's first-ever Cultural Awareness Assembly. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Principal Benson stepped to the microphone. "Today, we're here to recognize the importance of understanding and celebrating the diversity that makes Ridgeview High unique," she began. This assembly was inspired by the voices of our students, particularly Serena and Miles Johnson, whose leadership has brought us here. A wave of applause erupted as Serena and Miles approached the stage. Serena took a deep breath and began. "We started this journey because we were tired of being silenced," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But this isn't just about us. It's about every student who has felt unseen, unheard, or unwelcome." Miles stepped forward. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without all of us working together. What we've done so far is just the beginning." The crowd listened intently as the twins shared their vision for a school where every student felt valued. Their words resonated deeply, sparking a standing ovation by the time they finished. Later that day, Serena and Miles returned to the mural, where a small group of students had gathered to add their own contributions to the wall. Elijah dipped her brush into a pot of green paint and added a single word beneath the swirling design: hope. Serena smiled as she watched. "It's amazing how far we've come," she said softly. Miles nodded. "And how far we still have to go." The following week, the twins received an unexpected email from a nearby school district. Inspired by Ridgeview's efforts, students at another high school were planning their own walkout to address issues of discrimination and inequality. The email thanked Serena and Miles for their courage and asked for advice on organizing the event. "This is bigger than we thought," Serena said as she read the email aloud to her brother. Miles grinned. "Looks like we've started something that's not going to stop." The ripple effect of Ridgeview's walkout reached far beyond their community. Articles about the mural and the protest continued to circulate online, and other schools began sharing photos of their own initiatives for unity and inclusion. Serena and Miles remained at the heart of the movement, but they also learned to step back and let others take the lead. Their father's lessons, about the power of collective action and the importance of empowering others, guided them every step of the way. As their senior year approached, the twins began to think about the future. They dreamed of taking their passion for justice beyond Ridgeview, of creating lasting change in the world around them. "Wherever we go, whatever we do," Serena said one evening as they sat by the mural, "we'll carry this with us." Miles nodded, his eyes fixed on the vibrant wall before them. "And we'll keep fighting for what's right." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the mural. It stood as a testament to their determination, a colorful reminder that change was always possible, and that even the smallest voices, when united, could create something extraordinary. The twins navigated through the maze of tables in the competition hall, taking in the hum of anticipation around them. At the check-in desk, a cheerful volunteer handed them their contestant badges. "Section B, seats 147 and 148, she said, gesturing toward one of the 4 large areas. Serena and Elijah moved toward their section, passing rows of identical stations equipped with scratch paper, pencils, and small digital clocks. They found their seats and settled in. Beside them, a girl from Japan offered a shy smile. "Good luck," she said in careful English. "You too," Serena replied warmly, while Elijah nodded in agreement. A proctor stepped onto a small stage at the front of their section, speaking into a microphone. "Welcome, contestants. The first round will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats and prepare your materials." Elijah closed her eyes, taking slow, measured breaths. She could almost hear their father's reassuring voice. "The numbers are your friends. Trust them, and they'll lead you to the answer." Serena reached across the aisle and gave her brother's hand a quick squeeze. No words were needed. They both knew how much they had prepared for this. Years of solving puzzles at the dinner table and competing in local tournaments had led them here. The proctor's voice cut through the silence. Round 1 will consist of 20 problems, increasing in difficulty. You have 90 minutes. When you hear the signal, you may begin. The room fell still, except for the faint hum of air conditioning. A sharp bell rang out, and hundreds of students flipped over their test packets simultaneously. Elijah scanned the first problem, relief washing over him as he recognized the language of mathematics. This was his element. Serena, already writing, moved confidently through the equations. The sound of pencils scratching on paper filled the air as the twins worked methodically, their years of preparation evident in their steady progress. The competition narrowed to its final round. Only a handful of contestants remained, and the tension in the hall was palpable. Elijah and Serena sat side by side, facing a screen displaying the last problem, a deceptively simple geometric sequence with missing variables. Elijah's hand hovered above her scratch paper, doubt creeping in. The formulas she had memorized blurred in her mind. Beside her, Serena noticed the slight shake of her brother's shoulders. Leaning closer, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "Remember what Dad always said about patterns? They're like puzzle pieces waiting to be connected." Elijah closed her eyes briefly, letting her sister's words steady her. She pictured their father at the kitchen table, patiently explaining how every number told a story. She exhaled slowly, picked up her pencil, and began with the basics. Her confidence grew as she worked through the sequence. Piece by piece, the solution revealed itself. Midway through, she noticed a hidden relationship between the variables, an elegant pattern others might overlook. Her hand moved faster now, certainty guiding her every stroke. Finally, she wrote down the answer, double-checked her work, and raised her hand to signal completion. The proctor approached, comparing Elijah's solution with the answer key. Her eyebrows rose slightly before she nodded to the head judge. "We have a winner," the announcer declared through the speakers. "Representing Hillcrest High School, Elijah Johnson has solved the final problem correctly." Thunderous applause erupted. Serena leaped from her chair, wrapping her arms around her brother as tears streamed down her face. The other competitors stood, their applause acknowledging the historic victory for Hillcrest High. Monday morning, the yellow school bus rolled into Hillcrest High's parking lot, where a massive crowd waited to welcome the twins home. As the bus doors opened, the students cheered wildly, waving handmade signs with messages like Math Champions and Hillcrest Heroes. Serena stepped off first, carrying the gleaming trophy, while Elijah followed, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. The crowd parted to form a path, chanting "Johnson, Johnson," as the twins walked toward the school entrance. Members of the Hillcrest Anti-Racist Committee rushed forward to hug them, their mural glowing in the autumn sunlight, a testament to the change they had fought for. Principal Benson, beaming with pride, addressed the crowd. "Elijah and Serena Johnson have brought more than just a trophy to our school," she announced. "They've shown us what determination, intelligence, and courage can achieve." Among the crowd stood Mrs. Grace, watching silently. A mix of emotions crossed her face as she saw the students she had once doubted now celebrated as heroes. At the top of the steps, Clara waited for her children, holding a framed photograph of their father. As the twins approached, she pulled them into a tight embrace, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. "We did it," Clara whispered, looking down at the photo. "David, they did it." The school's mentorship program flourished in the months that followed, with Serena and Elijah at its heart. Serena led discussions on equity and justice, while Elijah mentored younger students, sharing their father's love of mathematics. During one session, a shy freshman solved a problem with Elijah's encouragement, her face lighting up with newfound confidence. "I never thought I could do this," she said. "You always could," Elijah replied. "Sometimes you just need someone to remind you." Years later, Elijah stood in the very classroom where Mrs. Grace had once taught, now his own. Math posters adorned the walls, and the same blackboard held new equations. "Good morning," he greeted his students with a warm smile. "I'm Mr. Johnson, and this is Advanced Mathematics." As he handed out their first assignment, he added, Mathematics isn't just about numbers, it's about solving problems and believing in yourself. From the back of the room, a hesitant hand rose. A nervous student asked, "What if we get it wrong?" Elijah smiled, hearing his father's words echo in his mind. "Mistakes are part of the process," he said. "What matters is that you keep trying." The classroom buzzed with quiet determination as the students began their work. Outside, the mural still stood, its vibrant colors and message of unity shining bright. As the sun set over Hillcrest High, Elijah lingered by the mural, tracing his name on the commemorative plaque. Serena joined him, her lawyer's briefcase in hand. "We've come a long way," she said. "And there's still more to do," Elijah replied. Together, they walked into the fading light, ready to continue the work their father had inspired in them, a legacy of resilience, unity, and hope. The competition hall buzzed with anticipation as the crowd outside grew louder, eagerly awaiting the results. Inside, Serena and Elijah sat quietly, soaking in the moment. The proctor's announcement still echoed in their ears. "We have a winner!" Elijah looked down at the medal hanging around her neck, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. Serena sat beside him, clutching the trophy as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "You know," Elijah began softly, "this isn't just for us. It's for everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong." Serena nodded, her smile unwavering. Dad would have been proud. The next morning, Hillcrest High was electric with energy. The entire school had gathered to celebrate their champions, filling the hallways and courtyard with excitement. Students wore Math Champions t-shirts, and banners hung from the walls, declaring, "Hillcrest Pride." As the school bus pulled into the lot, Serena and Elijah exchanged nervous glances. "Ready for this?" Serena asked, holding the trophy carefully in her lap. Elijah grinned. Not even a little. The bus doors opened with a hiss, and the twins stepped out to thunderous applause. Classmates, teachers, and parents cheered, their voices blending into a joyful roar. Signs bobbed above the crowd. "You did it! Johnson Twins forever! Hillcrest Heroes!" Principal Benson stood at the front, beaming as the twins approached. Even Mrs. Grace was there, her usually stern demeanor softened into something almost resembling pride. The crowd parted, creating a pathway for the twins. Someone started chanting their last name. "Johnson! Johnson!" It spread quickly, soon filling the air with the rhythm of their achievement. At the top of the steps, Clara stood waiting, holding the framed photo of their father. The twins hurried up, their smiles widening as they reached her. Clara pulled them into a tight embrace. "You've done something incredible," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would be so proud." They looked at the photo together, the late morning sun casting a golden glow over their father's warm smile. For a moment, it felt as though he were standing there with them. As the days passed, the impact of their victory began to ripple outward. The story of the Johnson twins and their win at the global mathematics competition became a local sensation, featured in newspapers, online articles, and television segments. But for Elijah and Serena, the true victory lay in what came next. The mentorship program at Hillcrest High gained new momentum, inspired by the twins' story. Elijah began tutoring students who struggled with math, using techniques their father had taught them. He focused not just on equations, but on building confidence. "It's not about being the smartest," he often said. "It's about believing you can solve the problem." Serena, meanwhile, turned her attention to social justice. She began organizing workshops on equity and inclusion, using their walkout as an example of the power of student voices. "The fight isn't over," she told a packed classroom one afternoon. "But we've shown that change is possible when we stand together." One evening, as the family sat around the kitchen table, Clara watched her children with quiet pride. "I've decided," Serena announced, sitting up straighter. "I'm going to law school." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Really? What brought this on?" Serena smiled. "Organizing the protests, fighting for justice, It made me realize how much change can happen when you understand the law. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his own thoughts swirling. And I want to teach math, he said after a moment. Clara blinked in surprise. But you always wanted to be a mathematician. I still do, Elijah replied. But being a mentor made me realize how much I love helping students see their potential, just like Dad did for us. Clara's eyes glistened with tears. Your father would be so proud of you both, she whispered. You're carrying his legacy forward in the most beautiful way. Years later, Hillcrest High became a model for inclusion and equity, thanks in part to the Johnson twins' efforts. The mentorship program flourished, the mural remained a powerful symbol of unity, and students from all backgrounds felt supported in ways they never had before. Elijah returned to Hillcrest as a teacher, standing in the same classroom where he had once faced discrimination. He carried his father's briefcase and used the same patient, encouraging tone that David had once used with him and Serena. Serena became a respected civil rights attorney, her passion for justice ignited by her experiences at Hillcrest. She often visited the school, sharing her journey with students and inspiring them to believe in their own power to create change. On the anniversary of the mural's unveiling, the Johnson family gathered once more. Clara, now sporting silver hair, stood between her children as they admired the plaque beneath the mural. Your father's smile, Clara said softly, touching the photo of David in her locket. It's in everything you do. Elijah placed a hand on the plaque, reading the words aloud. In honor of the students who dared to demand justice and inspired a legacy of hope. We've come so far, Serena said, her voice filled with quiet strength. And there's still more to do. Elijah nodded, his gaze lingering on the vibrant colors of the mural. But we'll do it, together. As the sun set, casting golden light over the school grounds, the Johnson family stood united, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, their father's legacy guiding them every step of the way. The sun dipped below the horizon as the day of celebration came to an end, leaving Hillcrest High in a quiet stillness. The mural, bathed in soft twilight, seemed almost alive with its vibrant colors. Elijah and Serena lingered in the courtyard, their reflections mirrored in the glassy surface of the plaque beneath the mural. I still can't believe how much has changed, Serena said, her voice a mixture of awe and reflection. Yeah, Elijah replied, gazing at the mural. But I think about Dad. He used to tell us that real change starts small, with one act of courage. And look at us now, Serena said, her lips curving into a smile. That one walkout turned into something way bigger than we imagined. The siblings stood side by side, letting the significance of the moment settle in. Around them, the school grounds were quiet, but they could feel the echoes of everything they had fought for in the air. Months later, Elijah's math class bustled with activity as students worked together to solve complex problems. Elijah moved among the desks, offering guidance and encouragement, his father's teachings woven into every lesson. At the back of the room, a student hesitated, her pencil hovering over her notebook. Elijah knelt beside her, his voice kind and steady. It's okay to take your time, he said. Math isn't about rushing to an answer. It's about finding the path that makes sense to you. The girl nodded slowly and returned to her work, a spark of confidence in her eyes. Moments like this reminded Elijah why he had chosen to teach. Each student's success felt like a small victory, a step toward fulfilling the promise he had made to himself and his father. Meanwhile, Serena's work as a civil rights attorney was gaining attention. She stood in a packed courtroom one rainy afternoon, her voice unwavering as she presented her case. The room hung on her every word, the strength and clarity of her argument shining through. Equality is not just a concept, Serena declared. It's a promise, one that we must uphold for every individual no matter where they come from or what they look like. Her conviction was palpable, and when the ruling came down in her favor, it marked yet another milestone in her journey. Outside the courthouse, Reporters surrounded her, cameras flashing. "Ms. Johnson," one of them called, "what drives your passion for justice?" Serena paused, the memory of her father's encouragement and the struggles she and Elijah had faced flashing through her mind. "My family," she said with a determined smile, "and the belief that we all have a responsibility to make the world a better place." Back at Hillcrest High, the mentorship program continued to thrive. Students gathered in the library after school, sharing stories and solving problems together. The mural outside became a symbol of their shared vision, a reminder that unity and understanding could overcome even the deepest divides. One afternoon, Elijah joined a group of mentees working on a particularly challenging math problem. They crowded around a whiteboard, bouncing ideas off one another. "Remember," Elijah said, tapping the marker against the board, "every problem has a solution. It's just a matter of finding the right perspective." His words sparked a breakthrough, and the group erupted in cheers as they cracked the solution. Elijah couldn't help but smile. The joy in their faces mirrored the pride his father had shown when he and Serena first solved their own daunting problems. The Johnson family's legacy continued to grow, touching lives far beyond the walls of Hillcrest High. Serena's legal victories set precedents that opened doors for countless others. Elijah's innovative teaching methods inspired students to believe in themselves, no matter their background or circumstances. And through it all, their father's lessons remained at the heart of everything they did. His belief in the power of education, compassion, and perseverance had shaped their paths, guiding them toward a future filled with possibility. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Clara raised her glass, her eyes shining with pride. "To David," she said softly, "to everything he taught us, and to everything you've accomplished because of him." Elijah and Serena clinked their glasses with hers, their hearts full of gratitude and determination. "To Dad," they echoed, their voices steady and strong. As the years passed, Hillcrest High became a beacon of progress, its story inspiring communities around the country. And at the center of it all stood the Johnson twins, living proof that courage, resilience, and unity could transform the world. The mural remained as vibrant as ever, its colors a testament to the power of hope. Beneath it, the plaque shone brightly in the sunlight, bearing the names of Elijah and Serena Johnson, the siblings who dared to demand justice, and in doing so, changed everything.